afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sue Minter, one of the co-chairs of the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council, and also an appointed member to the council. And I am very happy for you to be here with us today. We are going to spend the next sort of hour and a half exploring together the document that the subcommittee has um, developed and is presenting. And the way we're going to spend the time together begins with an introduction to our work with my co-chairs, Sarah Phillips and Kaya Morris. I just heard that Sarah had hoped to be present physically and is no, oh, there she, but she made it, miraculous. Okay, but she is with us. So and then what we're going to do is then walk through a little bit of our document, first our process and our document. Um, we are then going to actually break into small groups. David Plum, our facilitator from CBI, will guide us into that, breaking out into small groups to practice trying to utilize these principles with some of the ideas that we know are being developed in other subcommittees. We're going to invite the public to join those subcommittees as well. And there will be facilitators in each small group. And then we will come back and share a bit about what we have learned and receive some thoughts and feedback from all of you. And then we will look to close this workshop at 5:30, at which point the subcommittee, our Just Transition Subcommittee, will stay on and have its meeting to do some business. So I don't want to delay. I think people, if they would like to, are welcome to introduce themselves in the chat. Other than that, we will have the chance to introduce one another in smaller groups when we break into those. And I am going to, I think, turn it over to Kaya and Sarah at this point to really introduce our guiding principles. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. How are you? My name's Kaya Morris. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the Just Transition Subcommittee. So we're excited to be able to have folks here and to share with you the work that we've been laboring over for the last several weeks that we hope will help to guide the work that each committee and all stakeholders that are going to be involved in this work will consider in bringing forth proposals for the ultimate plan. So we do you should have received, we posted on the internet, and those who are members of the Climate Council as well have received a copy of the guiding principles for our just transitions that the committee has put forth. But I would love to be able to share with you a little bit about this work and some of the actual text from it, which I think helps place it in context for each of you to be able to understand a little bit more. We're going to go into talking about as well how we went through the process of creating the guiding principles. We're going to talk you through some basic highline items with regards to those principles. We're going to go through an exercise again that's going to use a tool that anyone can utilize to try to help dive deeper into integrating the concepts of the guiding principles into the work that we have ahead of us. Recognizing this is always an evolving process. So excited to be able to have you here. But before I go any further, I should allow for we have everybody here. Thank you. I'm excited to be able to bring into this conversation as well my co-presenter. Do we still have you there? I'm
I
looking
see
for everyone.
Sarah. Sarah's there.
Sarah, are you here? Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself to the
I'm
group
here.
for the
Sorry,
members of the public?
I had full muted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I apologize. Thanks, Kaya. Sorry, I'm ready to share some slides. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Sarah Phillips. My day job is the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity in the Department for Children and Families, and I'm one of the co-chairs. So I'm going to share some slides that are going to help us walk through this morning.
Fantastic. So thank you for this, Sarah. So as well, if you have any questions, please let us know, as we're going to have some opportunities for discussion within this. So really looking at the just transition principles that we have placed in front, we're really trying to think about what is it that we are trying to achieve with this work. It is not just about mitigating the climate crisis, but how are we moving towards an actual just transition, one that helps to support all stakeholders, involve all beings on our planet, and recognizing what we're doing here in Vermont and beyond. So what does that mean when we talk about a just transition? So what does that actually mean in tangible terms? And how do we use this line of thinking along with the guiding principles themselves? Next slide, please. So what we need you to know, there's 4 things we would like you to take with you with regards to this work and the work we're going to do today and in the future using these guiding principles. We need to recognize that this might, and it actually should, feel uncomfortable sometimes, and that's okay. We're asking for everyone to step into a slightly different way of thinking and processing the work that we do. We're trying to incorporate more ideas, more voices, and more people into a process that often can be very linear and feel siloed, and we're trying to crack that open. And so just as you're learning new muscle memory, it takes time and it takes practice, and there is some discomfort along the way. We want to recognize that this is going to be heavily focused on process itself, right? So that is an important component of it. It's not just about the products that we're going to create. What was the process that was involved? Because this is how we build out true engagement. This is how we build out true buy-in. And this is how we ensure that the voices of those most impacted are baked into everything we're doing. We also want to recognize that you're going to likely find as we go through this work that you're not going to be able to answer all the questions that we're posing just yet. That's okay. Again, sit with that discomfort. Recognize that there will need to be more work. You are going to have to dig a little deeper. We're going to have to reach out a little bit further, and we're going to make sure that we will have the input that's necessary. Again, the engagement from these different sectors and communities that are most impacted to make sure that the recommendations are solid. But overall, understand that the approach is meant to guide us to think and act differently when it comes to how we're addressing our climate crisis.
I think I'm going to jump in here just a little bit because we thought we should make sure folks kind of understand the process of how we came to develop these draft guiding principles. And so just some highlights just to I think as other subcommittees are also aware, subcommittees were just coming together really in March, and that's true for us as well. And we worked hard to come to consensus actually on these draft principles that we've shared and the tool at the end of May. That's some pretty fast work actually on our end. We did look at other state and national models, right? We're not the only state that's been charged with looking at equity or just transitions as part of the climate transition. We really listen to each other, and what we've put in front of you, I think, is truly a reflection of co-creation of what our group has put together. It's not simply 1 or 2 people's voices. It's really the work of our whole subcommittee. And then finally, I think we wanted to say we've really been trying to live into what these principles are in the work of our subcommittee and how we work together. And I'll just add a caveat that I don't think that's always easy, right? It takes hard work to do that sometimes. And so just a little bit sort of on how we as a subcommittee got to presenting these draft guiding principles to the Climate Council. I also wanted to pause. I felt like this was a moment in our sort of presenting it to you all today where I could ask if other members of our subcommittee wanted to add anything else about the process and how we got to where we are. And don't feel like you need to, but if you wanted to, I think now you'd be welcome to do that. Okay, that's fine. And we didn't press them that we were going to ask them that, but I wanted to create space for our subcommittee, my subcommittee members to jump in.
Sarah, you muted.
Sarah, you seem to be.
Okay.
You seem to be muted,
Sorry.
Sarah.
Classic. All right, I'm back. Okay, so we're going to walk through the document. we know that some of you have done that. We are hoping that in this workshop, the whole point is to dig in a little deeper with you, right? But we don't want to presume that everyone in this workshop has necessarily seen us talk about sort of what's in it yet. So just kind of the basics are that the guiding principles for just transition includes an introduction that kind of lays the groundwork around like where did just transition subcommittee come from, what is our task, and what are the guiding principles all about. Then there's some key terms we'll talk a little bit about. It talks about what we're calling impacted and frontline communities, and we use those terms pretty interchangeably, and we'll talk a little bit about that and what we mean by that. And then there are in itself 6 guiding principles that are meant to guide our work together as a climate council. And again, just to say this is draft, we'll talk a little bit about what that means when we call it draft. And then we have some self-assessment questions and an actual tool that we call the rubric that's really meant to take those guiding principles and help people as they're shaping their recommendations to bring those principles to life in their recommendations. The resource section is something we're still building, and we hope to add in sort of our final subcommittee guiding principles. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to you.
I want to make sure I'm unmuted as well. So there we go. Thank you so much for that. So I did want to share with you a little bit some of the actual text from the introduction to our document itself, and then briefly talk you through a little bit of what our definitions are. But I think there's some really high level ones that we want to make sure that everyone is kind of hearing and understanding. So the term just transitions is a way of framing for government and business action on climate change. Its work encompasses both public policies and business action to deal with the impacts of industry transition away from greenhouse gas emissions for jobs and livelihoods. So this is the transition out, and aims to generate low to zero greenhouse gas emission jobs and livelihoods of a sustainable society. So this is what we're seeking to transition into. And so the Just Transition Subcommittee, we believe in proactively centering equity in our work. And so the guiding principles are meant to frame the work of the council and the subcommittees around a true equity lens. And so while the legislature has asked us to focus on Vermont, we also want to make it clear that the decisions we make here have repercussions outside of our borders for which we're also accountable. So within the document itself and the way that we're processing this, we're offering key definitions and clarify indicators of, quote, rural, low income, and marginalized communities as outlined within the Global Warming Solutions Act. Next, we lay out draft guiding principles, as we've talked about. And so these are intended for the council and the subcommittees to evaluate, to develop our respective strategies and programming. And so they're meant to really spark dialogue within the subcommittees and the broader community, and to serve kind of as like a grounding checkpoint to ensure the inclusion of equity. They will be especially useful in different policy areas that might not traditionally be considered within that equity lens and would otherwise reinforce historically marginalized, disadvantaged, and underserved communities, just reinforcing those inequities. Finally, we feel that this is important to name that when developing these draft principles and questions, the subcommittee was heavily influenced by the perspectives of Indigenous voices who urged the group to expand our understanding of what frontline communities are to include both the earth and all living things, as we recognize that our human survival is not actually possible without taking all life into consideration. Indigenous communities have long held the belief that we as humans are here to steward the land that we thrive upon. And many Indigenous people have felt that their voices have been unheard and the stewardship ignored. So in this context, a just transition can help to establish reparations for the earth healing. And we really also take guidance from an excerpt which comes from the Indigenous Principles of Just Transitions through the Indigenous Environmental Network, which says, quote, a just transition acknowledges the earth as a living female organism, or our mother. So water is her lifeblood. The earth and father sky with its air and atmosphere are the source of life to be protected, not merely a resource that's to be exploited, degraded, privatized, or commodified. So what you see there on the screen are really important concepts around definitions that we're using. We are looking at the concept of distributive equity. So it is looking at the disparity in the allocations of different resources and outcomes and such. We're looking at procedural equity. which is often referred to as the equitable planning and implementation of this work. We're looking at contextual equity that ensures that mitigation and strategies take into account those most impacted, who are the least contributors to the harm. And then the corrective actions, that corrective equity, it ensures that mitigation and strategies provide communities with processes for accountability. We also go a step further, and we're looking at definitions of environmental justice and climate and energy justice. So we're driving the thoughts around environmental justice as being the equitable access to environmental benefits, but proportional distribution of those burdens and fair and equitable treatment and meaningful involvement in the decision making and in recognizing the needs of all groups, right? Climate justice operates at the intersection of racial and social rights and environmental and economic justice. So it's got to focus on the root causes of climate change, and it calls for that transformation towards a just and community-led economy. So next slide, please. So this is also an incredibly important component of this work, thinking through who are impacted in frontline communities. So the criteria that we're utilizing and recognizing again, these are draft principles. And so more voices may come to the fold as we continue to do this work. But we recognize that those who are highly exposed to climate risk, such as flooding, extreme temperatures, and health risks, we're looking at those who experience oppression and racism and are excluded from opportunities or have left resources to adapt to climate and economic change. We're looking at those who bear the brunt of pollution and negative effects from today's fossil fuel and extractive economies, and we're more likely to experience a job transition as Vermont addresses climate change. So you can see the word cloud that's been placed there to really kind of think through who are some of these impacted groups, names and communities that we may not have previously considered. Next slide, please. So what we have here are our draft principles, as Sarah was talking about before, and it's really looking at a comprehensive way, a creative way, an innovative way, an important way to think about whether or not the strategies we're bringing forth, are they inclusive? Are they transparent? And are they innovative, especially when we're thinking about how to engage our most impacted communities, right? Is it accountable and restorative? So not just naming that there is a harm, but how does it help to heal, right? We're moving at the speed of trust, recognizing that harm has already been encountered, harm has already been embodied in many communities and in many different areas of our state. And so how do we rebuild trust? It is by moving at the speed of trust. We are working in solidarity. If one of us is not free, none of us are free, and we can leave no one behind in this process. So as we're moving towards a just transition, it is a central component of solidarity with impacted and frontline communities. The most impacted first. So we need to lift up those who, again, are the most in need of these supports, are least likely to receive supports under our current way of being, and a full recognition that the way we are doing things is not acceptable. The status quo is not sustainable. So we are also truly centering the needs of our workers, our families, and our communities. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Sarah a little as we go through some of the different components.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. So our guiding principles includes a section that takes those principles that Kaya just sort of provided an overview of. You know, if you look at the document and dig into it, you'll see under each of those high-level ideas is a number of specific ways, specific things that we mean when we say most impacted first, when we say innovative, transparent engagement, right? And then what our group, what our subcommittee has done is drafted some self-assessment questions that really help, are meant to help shape recommendations and help shape the strategies and the policy work of the subcommittees as you're doing that work. So there's a number of questions under the topic around impacted and frontline communities, right, which is really about identifying the impacted frontline communities and those most impacted, analyzing burdens and benefits, are we ensuring equitable and just engagement, questions that relate to funding and data, and then questions that relate to implementation and outcomes. And so you'll see as we, our intention today is to break into some small groups and dig into these a little bit more. We also have drafted a scoring rubric that's really just another tool, what we call sort of a beta test tool. It's another way, it's another mirror to reflect back and to sort of ground check around recommendations as they're shaped. As one of my co-chairs, I think, rightly put forward as an analogy that helps me really understand, if you're studying for a test and you're going to take a test or you're going to write a paper, you want to know what you're going to be graded on before you write the paper, right? And so that's kind of where we're at in this process, is trying to understand what do we mean by a just transition? What is the subcommittee sort of, even though we're seeing this as a draft at this moment in time, we want to put it out there so that as the subcommittees are doing their work and thinking about strategies and recommendations, they have a sense of what they'll be graded on potentially. So just, again, gut check. Guiding principles are really setting expectations for us around how we're doing our work, what recommendations we're going to make, and how investments, implementation, and oversight occur. So again, we want to use them to shape recommendations now. We want to walk through a few examples with you around how we think this looks. So we have this is pulled right out of the rubric, but again, the rubric is really the same, it's really the self-assessment questions for the subcommittees, just kind of framed in a different way or a different tool, right? So frontline and impacted communities. So to address this criteria, a proposal or a recommendation would have identified the frontline and impacted communities, and it would have evaluated its impact on those communities and attempted to mitigate any potential harm as applicable. So here's a potential example. Financial incentives for zero emissions and or electric vehicles. So what would it mean to look at those impacted and frontline communities sort of self-assessment questions or criteria when we're thinking about financial incentives for zero emissions or electric vehicles? Well, identify the communities that already have access to these transportation options, right? And who doesn't? Evaluate and list impacted communities that aren't visible in the proposal itself, right? So in the process of putting forward this proposal, you're asking the question, oh, wait, who's not benefiting from this proposal, or who doesn't have access now? Or you're just trying to bring to light what those impacted communities are. And then meaningfully exploring any potential solutions that would lead to an increase in more equitable participation amongst those identified impacted communities. So that's kind of how we would see this idea around impacted and frontline communities, as you're thinking about a specific example. I'm going to keep going. Analyzing benefits and burdens. So again, to address this criteria, we would see that the proposal or the recommendation has already gone through the work of identifying frontline and impacted communities, and that you're reviewing that and thinking about it. You're evaluating the social, economic, and environmental impacts across all of those impacted communities. We're understanding the effects of the proposal or recommendation on the named identified impacted communities. And then you're attempting to mitigate any potential harm in the way that we're shaping that recommendation. And then we've identified that there's a special consideration here that really, we would say, has to do with both the immediate and the intergenerational or long-term benefits and harms of the proposal, right? So there's short-term benefits and harms potentially, and then there's long-term benefits and harms. And so those are two aspects of this that would want to be considered. So here's a potential example of greener and or electric public transportation options. Right, so you've identified all of the communities that have historically been marginalized or deprived from those transportation options, or historically have benefited from them, but you're doing some analysis around impacted and frontline communities. You're listing any potential social or economic burdens that could result from upgrading from fossil fuel to an all-electric or low greenhouse gas transportation fleet, right? You're addressing potential cost measures or thinking about how we would pay for those to ensure that relying on public transportation, the people who rely on public transportation would not be disproportionately impacted by those changes, right? Either socially, economically, or environmentally. identifying or considering any long-term effects of that recommendation, and then assessing any harms and actively exploring potential solutions, viable solutions. I know some of my subcommittee's members would point out it's all about viable solutions. Chris Campany, I'm channeling you, that could lead to increased and more equitable benefits for all Vermonters. I'm going to give one more example. So we have some assessment questions and some criteria around funding and data, right? So to address this kind of criteria in a proposal or recommendation, we would see assessing the potential economic or social costs of the development and administration of the recommendation, evaluating cost impacts on identified communities, attempting to mitigate any potential harm if there was any, clearly understanding both direct and indirect costs for impacted communities in the design and in the implementation, and then noting available programs or other ways to ensure that those costs are distributed fairly and equitably, right? Like potential incentives or ways to pay for it that alleviate financial burdens for impacted communities. So here's a potential example when we're thinking about funding and data. Building a new hydroelectric facility. So you'd want to evaluate, obviously, all funding sources that could potentially reduce overall costs for ratepayers in the state of Vermont. Again, go back to identifying the frontline and impacted communities that might be disproportionately impacted by the plan's opening and assess available steps to alleviate those burdens. You'd evaluate local and statewide fiscal impacts of the plant's construction and operation, both on the community and the environment, to ensure that those financial gains are shared equitably and that potential financial burdens would be alleviated. And then, prioritize local businesses, labor unions, jobs, environmental stewardship, and then use available data over time to evaluate equity throughout the design and implementation process. I want to recognize that as I go through these examples and talk through it, that there's probably a lot of questions that are coming up, a lot of like, well, how would that work, or how would that really look? And so this is our attempt to kind of try to breathe life into it a little bit. At the same time, we want to recognize and just put out again that this is a draft, and we call it a draft because we see us at the stage of the game where we're putting it out there. We're wanting people to use it now, to breathe it in, to digest it, and we need folks to try it out and to give us feedback. Tell us what's not clear, what needs more clarity. Tell us what's confusing. Help us understand how to make these assessment questions more meaningful for the process or the rubric tool. So that's where we see that we're at in this process. So we just want to say that's part of what we're doing right now. We don't think that this is necessarily a final product or in its final form. And also to say that I think our intention of our subcommittee is to be here to help. And so part of what that might look like is having a conversation together with other subcommittees and across the council, like what resources will your subcommittee need in order to do this kind of work as you're shaping recommendations. And I know there's been some conversation about could that be a consultant that could help you. Certainly our Just Transition subcommittee members, many are participating in other subcommittees, and many are in the process of joining those other subcommittees as well to help as these kind of issues are coming up. So I think where we see we're at right now is that our subcommittee is going to take in that feedback. We're going to discuss it. We're going to make changes, and then we're going to issue our final recommendation to the Climate Council. Because ultimately, it's the Climate Council, not our subcommittee, that has to decide how it's going to incorporate these principles into an initial climate plan. So, right now, it's draft. It's meant to be draft. It's meant to have people start to use it to shape recommendations, digest it, give feedback, help us improve it. We'll come back, provide something to the Climate Council, and ultimately the Climate Council will have to decide how to incorporate it into the climate plan. So
Thank you.
I'm going to pause right there, and maybe that's a good moment in time before we do some breakout groups, just to take some questions as we've presented a lot of information.
Actually,
Yeah,
Sarah, if I may, Oh, I apologize, Chairman. Thank you. There was something that I did not mention in my earlier slide that I just wanted to clarify on. So as we move towards the breakout group section and we're thinking about utilizing how we might utilize the rubric, for example, the way that it was designed was to provide two different ways for depending on the type of processing that you'll need to do. Today, it's going to be more conversational and you can kind of feel your way through it. It's meant to give you both an analytical space of like, this is what I need. I need numbers to be able to kind of quantify what I'm doing, versus those that need a more narrative format. And they can work and should work in tandem together, but they're meant to be able to provide multiple ways of learning and recognizing that we all have different ways of processing that. So I do appreciate the time to just explain that briefly for folks as I will pass it back to Sue. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Sarah and Kaya for walking through that, and to also just pause for a moment to reflect on this is new territory for all of us, and we have done what we think we were asked to do, which is to create an authentic piece of work that really shares the voices of a great and diverse community that has come together in our subcommittee, and to think about how we apply them as we move forward in this process. So this was our task. This is our presentation. We are now going to actually break into small groups to sort of do it together. But before doing that, we thought we would at least take a moment. And actually, David, Sarah, maybe you should stop sharing the screen so we can kind of see one another. And I'm going to ask David to help sort of facilitate. But just right now, if there are kind of key clarifying questions that we can try to illuminate before we kind of break into groups that are going to try to process a few ideas together. And I'm going to just ask at this moment that it be members of the council and subcommittees asking clarifying questions at the moment.
Super. Thanks, Sue. So I'm happy to help guide this. I see Secretary Moore's hand is up. Go ahead, please.
So I had a question around use of the word industry. It had really jumped out at me when Kaya was going through the introduction of the guiding principles document. And it talks about thinking about government and business. And I guess I'm interested in sort of if and how to consider the role of the individual.
Can you expand a little bit more?
Oh, hang on, Julie, your mic is off.
Sorry, my dog started to bark and then I forgot to take care of that. Just look, it talks about that second paragraph in the introduction, talking about public policies and business actions to deal with the impacts of industry transition away from greenhouse gas emissions. And I look at, and maybe it's just thinking about the types of actions that I am anticipating will be part of what we need to do in Vermont, from promoting the use and adoption of electric vehicles to looking at how we heat and cool our homes and businesses. And I just am challenged to fit those pieces together. And I think it's the word industry I'm stuck on, because I'm not sure what industry would be in that case.
Sarah, Julie, I'm wondering, are you really suggesting that we should include the individual in that paragraph, and maybe that you also feel the word industry is somewhat inappropriate there?
I do think there's an important role for the individual to play, and would love to see that acknowledged. And I guess maybe was as much looking for sort of what is intended through the use of the word industry, because I'm struggling to understand what's meant.
So if I may, I think part of the challenge of what we'll need to be doing is defining which industries are a part of this process. And so as we're looking at a just transition, there are industries that will need to figure out what that transition looks like. On an individual basis, I think the emphasis was placed less, because currently we have programs. So yeah, you can buy an electric vehicle, you can compost, but we don't have residential pickup. We passed a law for composting with no residential pickup. Electric vehicles are not affordable. We can use public transportation, but it isn't widespread. So placing the onus on the individual actions when we haven't built out an infrastructure for people to participate also places a value on individuals as though they are choosing to not participate in what we're trying to build, when we haven't built in mechanisms for people to meaningfully do so. So we want to use a caution against saying, well, why aren't you weatherizing your home? Well, because the process to apply for weatherization is onerous and complicated, and not everyone qualifies, and it still requires a lot of capital, so there's things like that we want to be thoughtful about. And I think that perhaps looking at the way that just transitions has been defined in other spaces, it does recognize that there's a human engagement within all of this, but that human engagement is often done through systems. It's done through entities. It is enacted through forces larger than any individual person, if that makes sense. So I think that would be great to be able to talk about that a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Kaya. Thank you. And I guess part of what I was reflecting on too is sort of the definition, to the extent it's a definition that was provided in the Global Warming Solutions Act that talks about looking to essentially adopt strategies that benefit and support all residents of the state of Vermont fairly and equitably, and just trying to figure out how to knit that language all together and make sure that we're sort of thinking across both, appreciating that there's definitions around just transitions that have been drawn from in other places, but also need to reflect back to what's in the statute.
Great. So I see some other hands. So Lauren, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. Thanks to the Just Transition Subcommittee for this really incredible, really thoughtful work. It's going to be very interesting and the good type of challenging, I think, getting this into our respective subcommittees. So really appreciate it. I'm looking at the equity screen now and wondering, seeing that there's the ranking 1 to 3, low for 1, 3 being high, if there was any recognition of, or if there's still time to expand that to incorporate a negative value. And I say that because historically, a lot of policies have not only not been just a low or minimal impact or benefit, but they've actually been quite harmful. And so I wonder if that's what we're supposed to be capturing with low, or if there's room to actually make sure that we're not creating policies that, first do no harm. I don't know if that's coming across clearly, but just flagging that as a question.
Thanks, Lauren. I know Kaya's been pretty intimately involved in developing that rubric, and I wonder if that's a adaptation that can happen. Kaya, if you want to chew on that for a little bit and see how that feels. Okay, cool, great. Joey, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Kaya and Sarah and the whole Just Transition team for your incredibly hard work and your thoughtful work in this framework. It's really important. Looking forward to digging in deeper and applying it and thinking through the examples which were helpful. One question I have, you use sort of a hydroelectric, I assume electric power plant example, which is highly unlikely to happen in Vermont, at least at a significant scale anyway. So I'm curious have you talked about, or do these equity principles apply to thinking outside of our borders? Meaning, are we externalizing our, so if we're relying on Hydro-Quebec or whatever, I'm just curious if you're thinking, should we be applying that lens outside of our borders too?
David, I'm happy to just briefly answer that one. I think I want to say thanks. We struggled to figure out what some examples would be, and so we just kind of went for a few that we thought were helpful for the purpose of this exercise. It's a point well taken about a new hydroelectric facility. Thank you. I think our subcommittee actually did, and I think this is a great question for our subcommittee to go back and continue to discuss. But we have discussed it a little bit, and sort of understanding that our actions that we take in Vermont have impacts and ripple effects that go beyond our borders. And I do think you'll see that mentioned in there in a couple places. And I think our intent is that we're thoughtful about that, but our focus is definitely on impacted and frontline communities in Vermont. And I hope for my fellow subcommittee members that I've reflected that accurately, but it has been an ongoing conversation for us in our subcommittee, and I would welcome others if other people want to add on to that. I'm also recognizing, David, I think the intent here is for our subcommittee to be listening and not necessarily responding to everything. So, but I wanted to just offer that.
Yeah.
And I'll just re-emphasize that ultimately we have to look to statute, which I believe we believe is really focused on Vermont. But we wanted to articulate in these principles that awareness that the impacts go well beyond Vermont.
Thanks, Sue. Okay, Billy.
Thanks, and thanks for your work on this. It's an excellent starting place for us. My question is primarily around kind of the intended sequence of when we would use this in our process. I know that a lot of the strategies we're developing, you know, could score vastly differently under almost each of these questions, depending on the kind of detailed approach we take in the future. And I don't think we're at a point now to know kind of which of those paths we're gonna take. So I'm just curious if there's an expectation that we're going to be using this kind of before the kind of co-creation process that we're hoping to endeavor undertaking with Vermonters over the course of the summer and fall, or if this is something that waits to the end of the process. Similarly, the funding piece is interesting because I often see kind of strategies separate from funding. This is what we want to do, and then the separate question is how do we pay for it? And you know, those almost need their kind of own level of analysis. So just curious if you have any thoughts on those 2 points.
I can respond because we have been giving this, especially as we've been trying to take on this idea of using these principles to guide and evaluate, you know, some ideas that have already been presented. It's not easy. And there will be some proposals that you've all come forward with, which are sort of so high level at this moment that they really, you can't necessarily evaluate them. So in that case, we really hope that at this point in the process, they're helping to center your thinking on really the implementation or the next level of detail. And we want this to be the way that we start thinking differently and have this lens in our work. And especially to your point, Billy, I think as we move forward through the more wider public engagement, we hope these ideas will come forward. They aren't going to be applied and scored now. It's not realistic, but we're hoping they become more integrated in our thinking and our path forward. I hope that makes sense to the others.
Thanks, Sue. And I think that echoes what we've heard in the Just Transitions conversations, which is the scoring rubric right now in particular is helpful in framing what things am I able to answer now and what questions do I have that require answering, because either I don't have the detail in the program or this is about implementation fundamentally. So I think the scoring rubric is a great tool now to sort of get your head around, oh, there's a bunch of stuff that I need to figure out in more detail, or I need to give signals about the kind of implementation we'd like on this. Are there other things before we jump into breakout groups? What we want to do, well, let me just pause. Are there other questions before we jump into breakout groups? Okay, great. Okay, so we know that this kind of material and this kind of thinking is hard to digest, and we all do it in different ways. And I think Kaya mentioned this already, like there's different ways that we assimilate things and work it through in our heads and our hearts. And so one of the ways that we thought would be helpful is to get in somewhat smaller groups, take one bucket of the questions and take an example, either using one of the ones that Sarah laid out already, or one that you have top of mind because you're working at it in a subcommittee, and walk through some of those questions and see how it feels, like how prepared you are or not prepared to answer them and what that means about your next steps. So we want to walk through and do that in somewhat smaller groups. And what we've done is randomly assigned folks, and I apologize for the randomness of it, but to one of 5 groups that match the 5 buckets of the questions that are at the back of the draft principles document, and there are also the 5 buckets that are in that scoring rubric. I'm just going to drop them in the chat right now so we have them handy. And what I put in the chat here is also a name at the end, which will be one of the co-chairs or myself, or also Abby, who's helping out, will be guiding that conversation, and we'll take, let's say 20 minutes to do that and see how it goes. So you'll see the group 1 will work on that first bucket of questions about impacted and frontline communities. And Kaya, I've set you up to be facilitating that group. Group 2 will look at the bucket of questions around analyzing burdens and benefits. Sarah, you'll be set up in that group if the technology gods are working for us here today. Group 3 will be looking at that bucket of questions around ensuring equitable and just engagement around these issues. Sue, you'll be taking that. And group 4 will be about funding and data questions, and I'll take that one. And then group 5 is that final bucket of questions around implementation and outcomes. And there's some questions there around jobs and other things. And we've asked Abby to take that one. And Abby, sorry about the sort of last minute notice on that, but thanks for helping out. And Liz Shields will stay behind and help any stragglers if you're having a hard time getting into a breakout group. Let me put in the chat before we go. And again, the purpose of being in smaller groups is just so we can all like process and think and talk. And we're going to encourage each of you to weigh in and think about it. One more thing for me to put in the chat here are some guiding questions, right? And this will help guide this 20 minutes we'll be spending together in this smaller group. The guiding questions are the following. What information would allow you to answer this question or these questions with more confidence, right? And is that information something that's attainable in the time we have to work together as subcommittees? The second question is about how, can you imagine how answering this question might shape the actual design of the recommendation you're working on or might be working on, right? So really drawing the link between the inquiry of the question and the design and the shape of what you want to put forward, or the signal you want to send for the implementation of that idea. Okay, so those are 2 sort of guiding questions that we hope to do. The first thing we're going to ask you to do when you get in together is do a quick round of introductions. Then pick from one of the examples that Sarah laid out, or one that's top of mind for you, a particular policy idea or recommendation, and work through some of those questions that are in that bucket of the group you'll be assigned to. Okay. For folks who are joining us as observers today, you'll just you'll be swept right into the breakouts as well. So you'll come join us. Before we jump in, any further questions about, sort of overall things that people want to clear up before we split up into smaller groups? Yeah. Absolutely. Members of the public will just, everyone should be swept up and into it. If there's been changes in who's here since we set up the rooms, Liz Shields will have to just distribute randomly, Liz, who's left, okay? All right. Okay, let's go for it. And, cross our fingers, the technology gods, this is going to work the way we want. And we'll be back in 20 minutes. And I look forward to hearing how it goes. Go ahead and accept the invite you have to join.
Hey, Liz.
Hey.
Mine didn't, I have like I don't know. Mine's like is asking me if I want to close all the rooms, but it's not.
No, don't do that. No.
Well, yeah, I know, David. I'm at least smart enough about that. But you'll put me somewhere?
Yes. I am not sure why it's not showing up, and I need to jump into my room as well. And I'm not quite sure why I'm not jumping into a room.
Will somebody put me somewhere too?
Me too.
Yep.
I'm here.
But
Yep.
yet
So
it shows that we're all unassigned, David. It shows David, Gina, Joey,
Sending-
yeah.
Katya.
So if someone could just start assigning quickly, that would be really helpful. Actually, I want to go to room 4 for me, Liz.
Oh, sorry. Just deny it and I'll send you another.
Thank you.
Or here, I can probably just. Your which number, David?
4,
Sorry.
please.
Sure. Go. I don't know, Jane. Where are you? Still here.
I'm still here.
Let's see.
I didn't see Liz on the list either to assign. Did you? Did she? She's still here.
No.
Maybe she just
It's
didn't
not-
accept because she was stepped away or something.
Yeah, that could be. But I don't even see your name anywhere on
Is it-
here.
That is so weird. Let's see. Maybe I can make myself go.
Can you? If you hit breakout rooms, can you hit join? Like where it would say, like
They
right
took it.
now,
Oh,
where that if there's 10 people, you could hit join.
oh my God, it's so annoying. I'll just say, oh yeah, here it goes. I can join any. It looks like I could just join. All right, I'm gonna join.
Okay.
I'll join 3.
Hi, Liz. I don't know if you can hear me, but if you're around, we're just going into breakout rooms. But you can stay here, and that's just fine too. Kelly, did you mean to come out of the breakout room? If you can hear me.
Are we back in the main room or are we all just back together again?
This is the main room. I figured you are here on purpose, but
we were told to leave the room, so we were very dutiful.
Well, you're in the right
Hi,
place.
Liz. Thanks for hanging behind.
Sure.
Hey, folks. So, Liz, can you send out a quick note that everyone's going to come back in a minute?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, we lost a minute. Okay, Jens, can you remind me what you just said about the data? You were picking up on Iris's point, and I didn't write it down, and I don't remember it.
Yeah, just all the data about existing inequality that I need, both in terms of what the effect of our programs, who's benefited from land conservation, from easements, who benefits from the land the state acquires in terms of wildlife management areas or whatever. We just don't have that baseline information about the equality of the implementation of the programs.
Yeah. We've been talking about mapping as an exercise, and everything is about what you're actually choosing to map and what are the overlays. So what we feel like it would be good in all of the kind of mapping, and Jens, you do a ton of mapping, how could we actually think about overlaying impacted communities on these maps? You know, we can look at demographic data in terms of poverty, race, and those are just some of those categories that we've tried to put. So that would be an interesting objectives, that we start actually looking to put overlays on the different kinds of maps that we have that we don't think about that for. I don't know. That data doesn't exist now, which in and of itself is interesting. The technology gods work for me, David Plum. I don't know. I'm the last person. I'm the biggest Luddite of us all.
Liz, are you pulling everybody back right now?
I can, yeah.
Could you just do that? That'd be great. Or you can throw me back to 4 real quick and I'll tell them.
It won't let me throw you back, so I'm just going to bring everyone back to this main room. Is that okay?
Yeah, even better. I hope you guys had a good conversation. Yeah.
Good. It was really good. And it's 5:15 and we're going to try to end at 5:30, David.
Yeah, so I thought we'd just do a little sharing of things that jumped out at us in no particular order, particularly how it felt to do this, to go through these questions and what that means in terms of the work ahead.
From anybody from whatever committee?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And so that's what I thought I'd do.
Well, I would recommend Jens and Billy to make their points in terms of sort of the questions.
Great. Everybody will come back in 10 seconds. We'll start to get folks jumping in. Okay, welcome back, folks. Welcome back, everybody. Apologies if you were yanked out of a good conversation. It's kind of the brutal aspect of breakout rooms and Zoom. Epic cosmic powers to just pull everybody out. All right. So thanks. And in my group 4, sorry, I disappeared there at the very end. Thanks for hanging in there. Okay, so what we wanted to do in the sort of 10 minutes we have left before we close up is get some insights about how it felt to have that conversation, how it felt to go through those questions and those ideas, and what that means about the work ahead in doing this in the subcommittees and then in council. So I just wanted to open it up in no particular order to say, what are some insights that people took away about how it felt to do that work and what that means for what's coming up in the work we have to do together. So don't be shy, jump in. Feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom world or unmute yourself if you're having a hard time with that. Richard?
So to me, it felt great to be in the conversation. And because people were being thoughtful and wanted to contribute to a joint collaborative conversation. And it would be my hope that, you know, most of the time that's how it's going to feel. I think it will be more challenging at times, and we're warned to be prepared for that, and that's good.
Yeah, great, excellent. Thanks, Richard. How about others? Anything that was like, this is really difficult. I don't know if that's where you were going to go, Secretary Moore, but the floor is yours.
No, I just wanted to reflect that that I found the questions useful in sort of guiding thinking about getting into the details, right? That we came in and suggested initially a what, and as you start to design the how you would actually affect that change. The questions were really useful in making what I would anticipate would be a much more thoughtful program. And so I think the timing of when we do this work, sort of the idea of having the principles articulated that can be front of mind throughout the development of the what, but then really getting into those meaty and substantive questions as you design the how, is going to be a really important piece. And it just made me reflect back on some of what Sue had said earlier in the conversation too, about that, the use of the tool at different points in the process.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. Did others have similar reactions or a different one about how this could be useful or how this could be frustrating?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the frustrating part. You know, after a system of structural inequality in place for so long, it's amazing how little we know about the inequality that's out there in our programs, and even the baseline inequality of the system of land ownership. And so as we think about strategies to, in our case, we were talking about maintaining a connected forest, you know, how do we go back and assess the winners and losers of our existing programs, and also even the baseline inequality of the land ownership system? And how do we do that? And what sort of strategies can we recommend to undo all of those structural inequalities? So yeah, frustrating but challenging and worth the effort.
Right. Right. It's a big lift, right? When you're working on years of things you're trying to change. And I think it raises the question how you feel like you're getting there in these different milestones of the work of the subcommittees, right? This milestone getting to the end of July, right? And then the milestone of getting to December 1st, and then the milestone of implementation and beyond, right? How are you going to feel comfortable we got as far as we could get in those different milestones, knowing you can't solve everything in the first go around? Okay, other reactions to doing this exercise? Ben?
Hi, thanks. So Sarah led us in the analyzing burdens and benefits group, and I asked if we could talk about, as our case study, a program where we're feeling a lot of implementation pressure, which is the first year of the state hazard mitigation program, which we've always said we wanted, and now we've got it, and now we have to design it very quickly thinking about a lot of things all at once. And once we got into the conversation, the questions were very helpful. We had what felt to me like a very productive and satisfying conversation. So similar to what Richard said, it was just great to get into it, and it quickly led us to identifying ways that we can proactively solve the problems or potential problems we're addressing, or how we can build a better program by thinking about these questions. So for me, it was a very satisfactory experience.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. Other reactions, then we'll talk about next steps before we close up. Ian?
Thanks, David. I just wanted to offer one reflection of something that stood out to me from the breakout group I was in. We were talking about impacted in frontline communities with Kaya. Ended up talking a lot about electric vehicles and kind of the Mileage Smart program as an example of an effort that is underway to try to address some of the inequities from impacted communities. And one of the key things that stood out to me from our conversation was we kept coming back to kind of the need for infrastructure to exist to support these values in order to make them real. And that infrastructure being not only something like the physical charging infrastructure needed, so renters who were predominantly low income could charge EVs, for example, but also social infrastructure so that the people who could benefit the most from these programs are aware of them and feel welcomed into and able to access them, getting around barriers of technology, geography, language, what have you. There were some folks in that breakout with me who were very committed to equity and justice, who were just found out about the Mileage Smart program for the first time. I didn't know it was statewide, and I thought that was an example of, not to pick on that program at all, but just like to demonstrate the need for, even when these programs exist and are done very intentionally and thoughtfully, we need to have authentic relationships built from the get-go with the people who we are trying to serve in order to understand the ways in which our program design is not just meeting our needs as administrators, but their needs as potential recipients.
Thanks, Ian. Abby, last word before we do some next steps.
Yeah, I can be really brief. So in our group, I think building off of some of the comments that were offered by other groups, we started with I think a very general recommendation, draft recommendation. We took a transportation topic of incentive programs to incentivize EV use for personal vehicles. And sort of to Julie's part about that was the what, and then as we got into the how, the recommendation actually changed to become incentives for low-income Vermonters to be prioritized as recipients of those EV vehicles in Vermont. And so I think that could be a really powerful example of how these just transition guiding principles could actually change recommendations to be more inclusive, to be more equitable as a result of these types of conversations.
Powerful. Very interesting. You combine like what Ian says and what you say, Abby, and there's a lot of opportunity space here. Okay, so in terms of next steps, I think Sue's going to close up this part of the meeting, this workshop. But I will say these are still called draft guiding principles and draft questions, in part because we know that there can be improvements to them. And we welcome input on, now that you've sort of starting to put your hands in there, how you might adjust them, refine them, improve them. So as we go, we will be improving it in real time. The feeling is Just Transition Subcommittee made an enormous leap forward with this, and there's probably ways to improve it. Our pathway here is, I believe, Abby, either Abby or Liz or somebody had raised their hand to say, please send emails to me if you have some specific thoughts on how to improve these guiding principles and questions. Just let me confirm, who was that's going to be the person receiving those emails?
Sarah put that in the chat. It's Claire McElhaney.
Claire, sorry, apologies. So Claire's your person, her email is in the chat, and please channel that feedback to her so that this is an iterative process. With that, Sue, I'll turn it over to you to close close up this workshop.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for digging in with us and being patient with what is, I think everybody thought, well, okay, now we're going to have this tool. It's a big job, and I really want to thank the members of our subcommittee who have really worked hard and worked together to come up with. As I said, I think this is new territory. It's been a little bit grueling, and we're really glad to hand it off. And we know we're not done, and we are hoping to be an asset to you now in your subcommittees to maybe try to work with you. We also do want to think about whether it would be valuable to perhaps have consultant support to actually work with subcommittees at some point in the process to engage more deeply than our subcommittee members with all the other things they do. So just an idea, and I don't really think I have anything more to say than thank you to everyone for being here. And I'll take this part of our meeting at a close. We'll close the workshop. We will now actually, in doing so, say farewell. Anyone is welcome to remain for 30 minutes to listen to the business of the subcommittee, the Just Transition Subcommittee. And for members of that subcommittee, please stay on this line. And we'll stay tuned and look forward to hearing more from all of you.
Thanks, everyone. Stick around if you're in Just Transitions subcommittee member, please.
Thank you for putting this on.
Good
work,
job. Team. Yay, team. Come on, everybody put on your
Yes.
audio and let's clap and cheer.
Yes.
Woo!
Good work. Just Transitions.
I didn't hear any rotten tomatoes.
Yeah.
This is how we begin to change a conversation. And that was a good audience. And I don't know, I'd like to hear what other people feel. I feel really pleased with the response at the end. And I think we also did a good job of introducing and having the breakout groups. What did other people feel?
I thought the breakout groups were very effective and a good way to measure how what we have done is being received. And I thought in our breakout group, the dialogue was very positive, and there was some good information that was shared, feedback that, I didn't know. I didn't know that they had EVs that were 4-wheel drive. I found that out. I don't think I could afford one, but that's nice to know.
You might be able to afford a used one, which is what the Mileage Smart program is. We can talk about that. Yeah, they're very rewarding. And it's all to the point. We all have to engage and learn together. Any other thoughts before we kind of get to our business? Kashka.
I thought it was really informative, and it was just wonderful to see things being uncovered as we kept talking. Just brainstorming, and with Kaya at the helm, we just kept uncovering more and more things that, perhaps they weren't thought of or weren't voiced before. So I think it's so important and just wonderful. What a great experience this is. Thank you.
And particularly great job to Kaya and Sarah for the intro and leading that. Again, really great job. Yay. Any other comments before we do our business?
Just want Amanda to jump in here, but we were in the science and funding discussion, and I think one of the concerns is, do we have the right data? And are we going to need to put a lot of effort in collecting much more data? And one of the things I think you could really use guidance from, as a state, from groups like the Capstone groups and others, is at what point does that data collection become invasive? How do you analyze it? How do you portray it? Because I know we think about that all the time at regional commissions, to like when we're plotting things out, you don't want to plot things out so at such a fine graining, you can point to like that house, they're having problems. But you still know where you need to really target the programs, and where you need to target the outreach, and where we need to be. So That came up a few times. Would you agree, Amanda? Was that part of it? Is Amanda still here? Oop.
I'm still here. Yes. Sorry. I agree. Not much else to contribute. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, and Amanda and I had done this exercise with the EV Pro, a lot of the same ideas had come from our processing. I just want to recognize that we really have hit a huge milestone. We've produced something that's never, I don't think, really been produced in this way. And it took a lot of work, and I'm really proud of all of you and us and happy. It's not going to get easier from here, but we've really come through, and I think it's really going to be useful. It's going to be change. Now, what we need to do today is both approve our minutes, the last 2 meeting minutes that were actually provided, I believe. And I guess I want to just do a check-in. These are actually minutes from June 3rd, as well as from May 27th, if anybody can possibly remember back that. But if you wanted to just, can we get a thumbs up if we're all good with those, or if there are any things? We finally got Ross McDonald's name spelt correctly. You didn't even put it in the chat that it was spelt wrong, but luckily somebody noticed and we got it right.
We still have worries, Sue.
Good. Okay, so we're going to formally accept all of those. We do want to report back from anyone who's been participating in other subcommittees. We want to hear from Jane. We want to do a check-in on public engagement and talk a little bit about the future. So I want us to go pretty quickly through those few things because I think it's really important we make an agreement on how we want to schedule ourselves into the future. So Jane, are there some quick updates from you?
I actually have some updates related to the engagement component of the work, but not much else. But did just want to take this opportunity to thank Sarah for going to National Life today to try to have our physical location. That, of course, it was the first thing that was brought up on our meeting today, and we messed it up, but we'll get it right for the next 2 meetings. And so thank you for going there, and I'm sorry that it didn't work out in the end. But
Yeah,
and then
I'm a troublemaker. They wouldn't let me in. They said, you don't belong
no way.
here.
No. And the only other update, just so everybody knows, because I'm sure she'll reach out to some of you, both with me and on her own, is that if you don't know, our GWSA coordinator starts on Monday, Marion Wolf. And so we're really, really excited to have her stepping into the role. And she's coming from emergency management. She works and helped to facilitate pulling together the state emergency management plan in 2018. And so has a lot of experience with pulling together large, complicated plans. And so we're really excited to have her on board. And so I'm sure she'll be reaching out and she'll be a face soon.
The hazard mitigation plan or the emergency management plan? Hazard mitigation?
The emergency management plan.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, that was good. That was quick. What about other subcommittees? Did I cut you off, Jane? I'm sorry. No. Okay. Other subcommittees that people might be participating in that they would like to report back to us all on. Yeah, Kashka. And then Chris.
So I was part of the data and science and data committee, and what we found is that it's going to be really challenging to pull together existing data, which frankly doesn't really exist as of right now. So that's going to be a challenge for them to see how they can fit certain parameters in what we had as our rubric, et cetera, with trying to pull in data that just, they're not really sure where to find it yet.
Kashka, thank you. And I want to just ask Jane before Chris, you report next, but Jane, is part of it that you've got a team coming on board that's to help with filling the answers to some of these data searches?
Yeah, Kashka just was a reminder as soon as she said science and data that we had our project kickoff meeting with the Cadmus team yesterday, who's the lead consultant for the technical analysis review. They also have on board for that team Energy Futures Group, which is based in Heinsberg, UVM, and then Harvard also to help with the carbon budget components. So we had our kickoff meeting. We have 5,000 other meetings of the individual tasks coming up in the next few days. And so one of the components of CADMIS is to look at some of the data sources associated more with the mitigation components, but there's also some conversation and a task group that formed within the new work plan of science and data, looking specifically at data needs, not data collection for this climate action plan, but recommendations on where the data gaps are, especially one elevated component of that is how it relates to the vulnerability index that Rural Resilience is talking about now. And so there's a conversation going about how to pull all the right interests together to have a conversation about data, and that will be facilitated by science and data by that task group. So yes, CADMIS will help, but maybe not as it pertains to the data that you all are interested in.
But I do think you've often said to us, as we think about data needs, we should be sort of cataloging them as we go. And I'll get back to something on that. But Chris, you had a report?
Such as it is. Yes, I'm looking at the agenda of a meeting that I do not remember at all, but that which I attended. So I'm just going to be real candid. Jane, if you want to jump in here, or Kelly, feel free. But I do remember there was discussion about coordination of sectoral stakeholder engagement with public service department. They talked over the summer work planning. I just don't remember the details of that. Lead business as usual, assumptions and results were presented. And there was discussion that Gina talked over, presented some of the work on transportation, but really I'm not remember. I'm just that may have happened. That may as well happen 20 months ago. Sorry, I'm just.
Are you reporting on cross sector?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay.
yes, cross sector. Yes, I'm sorry.
I've decided to call this COVID fog brain because we're all in it. We're all like, can't remember. And I've been starting to think maybe it is actually the virus itself. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
I
it crossed.
put
Go
Chris
ahead, you go,
on the
Kelly.
spot. No, I put Chris on the spot because I had to leave partway through, so I also didn't get all the information. So Jane, please let us know what did we miss?
Well, just so folks are, if you're interested too in reviewing the video from that talk, they have draft strategies percolating up out of their task groups now. And at last week's meeting, they presented on transportation and non-energy emissions, those two sectors. And not this week, because this week's an off week, but next week they'll be presenting on buildings and thermal, which might be of interest, and electricity and energy. And so those ideas are at a very high level right now, but there was a substantive conversation about then where they take it to the next level for the presentation at the end of July to the full council. And then also both at Science and Data and Cross Sector last week, the SEI consultants working for the Public Service Department and in concert with the Department of Environmental Conservation put forward the business as usual model. So if we did nothing with policies as they are in place, how far would we get with emissions reductions? And I'll just say that it was actually shocking how far we would get without doing anything, which was, I think everybody is now questioning the assumptions that went into that model. But it was interesting, and there's been a lot of discussion back and forth about those assumptions because they'll be the basis then for all future modeling that we're doing with CADMIS. But I encourage folks, the Science and Data one went into more detail, the presentation, if you're interested in that. Pretty interesting how far that we will get without doing much, just based on the policies in place. And so that was it. And cross sector, yeah, that they have a pretty aggressive timeline, but the work plan is also up there as a supporting document right now. And so if you're interested in seeing what's next and how they plan to pull it all together for July, it's on the supporting docs page. Sarah, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, Jane, so that's exciting and also really fascinating when you say, sort of when you look at the data, if we did nothing, we would still be doing a lot in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So it makes me think about if we do nothing, what does that mean around these questions around equity and just transition? And so how would we insert that into the conversation, just as like a light bulb for me? Because if in the end it's like, well, we don't need to do that much to achieve the goals, I think we'd be like, well, we have some other goals over here. And how would we make sure that we would do that?
I'm just going to say I'm not confident of that, of those results. And one of the reasons is because Sarah and I also met with Jared Duval from Energy Action Network, who we'd like to recommend present to us at our next convening, although he cannot meet on July 1st, but could on the 14th. But we have just had to think about our next meeting. But he, EAN, Energy Action Network, is very interested in sort of equity issues around energy, and has done a lot of analyses that make me wonder about that that conclusion, because they seem very different from the analysis of EAN. But you know, we'll put it all together in the soup. But that would be a recommendation, that we actually invite him to our meeting to do this presentation, and especially the energy burden. Because if, in fact, to your point, Sarah, if there's not as much reduction we need to do, then we need to rethink the burden, and how do we relieve that burden? So maybe we focus more on that. So we'd love to do that. I guess I want to hear from people whether they feel that we should take, I think, approached the idea that we might meet every other week. And then, by the way, in the off meeting weeks, then the co-chairs are meeting. And that we then try to join other subcommittees. Is that what people would like to continue to do? And is that working? I see heads nodding. Does everyone have a place to go? In other words, another subcommittee to join? Or if you are lost in search of one, why don't you reach out to Jane for direction? I feel like I've lost track of where I'm supposed to be, so I'm going to try to do that. I actually don't feel like we have a big report on public engagement, other than to say that we've been communicating with Sarika, who I believe is really ready to start having meetings with the stakeholders with whom they are interviewing, and then pulling together roundtables, including a BIPOC roundtable and then a sector leader roundtable. So that is going forward. I don't know, Kaya or Jane, if you had anything more to add on that.
David and I met with them yesterday, the consultants, and had a good conversation about, again, educating me on the goals of this first phase of engagement. And they had already extended invitations for the interviews and the BIPOC roundtable. We're looking to perhaps now do 2 smaller BIPOC roundtables, because folks were interested in participating but couldn't make this coming Monday. So they were thinking about doing 2 Monday nights to try to get some better representation. And then the sector roundtable, we finished getting the names and agreeing to the list last night or yesterday afternoon in that meeting. So we feel like we've done a better job of getting a broader representation around the table for that group. We also talked a lot about process, and that's at some point with all of you, we'll want to talk about sort of process for how we engage with the consultants, because I suspect they were getting hit from too many angles with ideas for this, and it felt a bit overwhelming of who they were supposed to respond to. So we'll want to talk a little bit about a streamlined process for communication with the consultants going forward, to ensure that we can reach consensus on what the list looks like from A&R's perspective, the contract holder, and then completely in support and in service working with Just Transition Subcommittee, but just making sure we don't overwhelm them again.
So I wanted to
David,
ask,
do you have anything to, oh yeah, go ahead.
I guess I want to know if at our next meeting, we want to include Jared. Do we want to include something from them, or do they need to kind of do their work for a while and then report back to us?
The timing of your meetings, I should have it in front of me, but they are due to present their Next meeting is July 1st. Okay, so they're due to present their public engagement plan the week of July 12th. And so your July 15th meeting would be a substantive meeting about the public engagement plan with them. And I think that would be the timing for their folks the next time to really talk with them.
Are people good with meeting? I have to admit that July 1st, I'm personally not going to be available, but I don't want to change anything for that reason.
I was going to suggest that, Sue, that we check in to see who's actually available on the 1st.
Raise your hand if you are not available on July 1st. Okay, I'm an outlier.
I'm kind of a.
I think you can live without me. It is supposedly going to be the beginning of a holiday weekend. It's my 30th anniversary, so I'm going to go away. Not very far, somewhere into the woods. Okay.
Fair.
And so we're going to meet on July 1st. I will not be there. And we'll meet again on the 15th. And it seems like the 15th is going to be about public engagement and a presentation from Jared. Sorry, I just saw, I can't read the, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll read the comments in the chat quickly just to say, this question around like working with the public engagement consultants, like maybe Liz says she'd be willing to do that. So maybe there is just a small group that we identify clearly as our liaisons with them. And then Iris, do you want to say more about your comment?
Yeah, just that as far as ag and ecosystems go, we are putting together a bunch of presentations to our subcommittee and open to others from a bunch of different people. We've got a whole list of people. Last week, we had Judy Dow do one on traditional ecological knowledge. I think that's right. And if anyone wants to watch that, it's really good in framing your lens as far as that goes for any other subcommittee work you're doing. So that's all.
That's awesome. Iris, I wonder if you would pop the link to that in the chat box.
I can do that.
Or Jane, thank you.
That sounds
I
really.
wondered then for the meeting on the 1st, if it makes sense for us to use that meeting to potentially, we'll have more feedback coming in on our guiding principles that we can regroup around that feedback and maybe discuss some of that. And maybe that would be part of what we do on the 1st. Just offering that as an idea, and I wonder what others think.
Sounds good.
All right. So we know we're going to try to convene on the 1st and the 15th, that everyone is going to go somewhere in the interim, that people who have time should definitely check out the Iris's thing in the chat. Sounds really interesting. And I think, well, let me just put a pin on the public engagement. Liz is interested. I am interested. Kaya, are you interested? And Amanda. Amanda's the person. I'm sorry, Amanda. I had you, maybe I wasn't remembering that it was you. So we're like a little team. And Jane, does that help for them to kind of convene us as needed in the interim before the 15th?
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially as they're developing the public engagement plan to know that who they should speak to if they have questions or concerns.
Great.
And that's good for me because we have standing meetings with them. And so as I see that coming up, I can invite you to those.
Oh, that's good. All right. Any final wrap up questions? We're going to like get out early. And I think it's still beautiful out. I don't know. I can't see. Sarah's window tells all. It's still beautiful.
Hey, Chris has his hand up.
Oh, Chris, thank you.
Oh, that was, I'm probably going to have some weeks I've got like, I'm doing like 10 hours of climate council meetings. I'm going to need to, I may need to like not, right now I'm engaging with cross sector with Kelly. I may need to like revisit that. I don't know that I can do their full 3 hours in a week. So it's not a big deal, but I guess I'm just putting out there, if somebody else can engage with cross sector, that would be great. But what would be really helpful for me is if in any of the committees, because I'm supposed to be wearing a municipal interest hat. If you guys are starting to get into land use planning or anything dealing with municipalities or regional planning commissions or land use or that kind of thing, if you could just kind of give me a wave or something, because that more targeted engagement on some topics might be helpful. I'm not complaining at all. It's just I'm running into kind of a physics barrier, like time space kind of thing. Just so if you happen to, so if you hear committees talking about that, that'd be helpful.
Great.
I run into that all the time. I completely understand.
Yeah. And then there's the mental health that we need to be thinking about, which is why getting out into the sunshine this evening would be great. Thank you so much, everyone, but especially hats off to Kaya and Sarah for really leading that on several occasions now. And David, also, I thought you did a beautiful job of making sure we all heard one another. I thought the question coming back to how did that feel? I feel a little badly because I think I rushed my group and tried to come up with a few points that we might share, and that wasn't what you were looking for. But how did it feel was a great question. That was a really important way to respond because I think it was meaningful. Everyone, thank you for your work and all you do. Enjoy the day, and we'll keep moving the ball forward. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Happy anniversary, Sue.
It's coming up in a week.
Everybody.